This thing was created in the late 1800s. Why anyone would think that you don't have to change the systems and the processes over 150 years, but we see that in government all the time. We see regulations and laws that are created in the 60s and the 70s, even the 80s, for a period of time when the technology was different than it is today. And so I think it's time for us to apply processes and think, if we were designing this stuff today with today's technology, how would we design it?
Oh, Lisa, when are you running for office?
Hi, I'm Shannon Huffman-Polson, and I want to welcome you to Facing the Wind, Season 2 of the Grit Factor podcast. We are going to have a great time this season with episodes bringing you experts from around the world in leadership, grit, resilience, purpose, and storytelling. I've listened to you over this last year, your comments, your responses, your conversations, your questions, and this really is a season that has been designed with you in mind. This really is a season that's been designed to answer those questions that you need to know in order to fulfill that mission that I know we have in common, that mission of the Grit Institute, which is building courageous leaders for a better world. We're doing that through our courses online at thegritinstitute.com, through our books, and of course, through this podcast. And if you have a question you'd like to have included, please head over to thegritinstitute.com/podcasts and leave your voicemail. It may be included on a future episode.
A keynote speaker and writer on partnership, mentorship, diversity, and relationship building, Lisa Gable's mission is to support the next generation of leaders and organizations that are solving the world's biggest problems. She is a 5-time award-winning Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestselling author and recognized as an innovative global businesswoman who leads with discipline and diplomacy. In addition to her multiple corporate roles, including CEO, Lisa has served U.S. presidents and governors, as well as a U.S. ambassador and UN delegate. Over the course of her career, Lisa has been called to turn around failing organizations, businesses, teams, nonprofits, political campaigns, and government projects to solve seemingly intractable problems. She has learned that the key to course correcting when things go south is applying process engineering, strategically evaluating everything your organization does and how it does it with authority and humanity. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today on Facing the Wind that was previously the Grit Factor. It's wonderful to have you.
It's so nice to be here and wonderful to talk with you as you're sitting in France and I'm in Virginia.
That's perfect. Well, you've certainly spent your share of time overseas, so I know you can appreciate exactly how it is that things work that way. Why don't you give us a little bit of a background on your absolutely incredible career and path that has brought you to where you are today?
Well, I've had a wonderful opportunity to do turnarounds in business, government, and philanthropy. Basically, I've been brought in by philanthropists, by billionaires, or a U.S. president in one case, or CEOs to help fix a problem that's headed south. And in each of those cases, they needed the function that that institution was supposed to do to happen. The problem is that nobody figured out a process by which to make it work. And so that was my special sauce. I did it by taking the business processes I learned at Intel Corporation and incorporating those with the art of diplomacy that I learned at the State Department and the White House to ensure that we got the job done, but we did it with a bit of humanity.
I love that. I love that. Well, maybe back up a little bit to Intel, since that was the place that provided part of that expertise that you were able to bring to bear. What was that experience like at Intel? There's very few women there, I understand, still today.
Well, this was back in 1989. So I was in the Reagan administration and I had an opportunity to recruit a woman by the name of Barbara Barrett. Barbara would later become the Secretary of the Air Force recently, but her husband at that time was Senior Vice President of Manufacturing at Intel. So as I was leaving the Reagan White House, I asked Barbara, I said, could I meet your husband? And he had just been indicated as being the person that would be the heir apparent for the CEO. So I flew out to Arizona and I went to work for Craig as his technical assistant in 1989, ended up spending some time in Taiwan and moving back to California. And essentially at that time, Intel had lost market share, as had the rest of the semiconductors companies, to the Japanese. Intel was $1 billion company when I joined it, and its number one goal, job one, was to retake control and dominance in the semiconductor market. While I was there, Intel ended up becoming and owning 85% of market share of semiconductors worldwide. So through that time period, I learned about the importance of setting job one, that one thing you have to do to survive and thrive. Everything at Intel was all about the chips.
Yes.
And then ensuring that you used quality improvement processes and statistical process control and other manufacturing techniques to make every program you did lean and mean. And we had a phrase, better, faster, cheaper. It dominated every conversation that we had. The other phrase was only the paranoid survive. So with that, I learned that you are just going to stay hyper focused. You're going to do what has to get done. You're going to use partnerships to move yourself there, but you are not going to allow yourself to get distracted.
Yes. Wow. Well, those sound very much like the lessons of the technology industry in the 80s and 90s in particular. That's right. Fantastic.
We need to get back there right now, actually. So I'm hoping that people are listening.
Yes. That's right. Exactly. So, and then how do you go from Intel to the State Department?
I was very involved with President George W. Bush's first campaign and was contacted by someone at the White House in 2004. They said, we're trying to fill this job and we need someone who's had experience working in Japan. We need someone who's a fundraiser. And I had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the president's initial election campaign and his reelect. Okay. And we need someone who, if by any chance they happen to know Howard Baker, the U.S. ambassador, that makes it even better. And at that point, I'm sitting there going, pick me, because I had worked with both Intel as well as the Department of Defense in Japan. I'd actually had a team of people that I matrix managed in Japan and spent some time over there. I knew how to raise money, and Howard Baker was my brother-in-law's godfather. So we had the trifecta. And they asked me to be the U.S. ambassador to the World's Fair in Japan, which is now known as the World Expo. Yes. And I was the first woman, and I'm the only woman since the founding of the World's Fairs back with the Eiffel Tower to have represented the United States in that function. That's incredible. And that is quite a cultural shift, isn't it, to be a woman in that role, especially in Japan? It was, and it was a shift because we had 200 different country delegations that were represented at the World Expo, and I was the only woman. All the other all the other ambassadors from the other countries were individuals that had been in their foreign service for years. Mm-hmm. And so for many of them, they had been ambassador to a country or two, and this was their going away present. So It was me and basically 199 peers who were all men. Wow. And so did you know this going into it? Did you have any ideas? Nothing going into it. So there were a lot of surprises. Unbeknownst to me, when I accepted this job with great enthusiasm, remember, I was sitting there waving that they needed to pick me. Right. It turned out that my predecessor had been indicted for misuse of government funds for the previous World's Fair back in 1998. And also, I discovered that World's Fairs had always operated at a huge deficit. So by 1998, when the gentleman who had a job before me going to another country had started misusing government funds. In fact, he set up foreign bank accounts, and you're not supposed to do that. And then they got bigger after they told him to get rid of them. Congress had it. And they said, no more government funds. You may not use any government funds for a U.S. participation in World's Fairs. We're tired of the huge debts. We're tired of the lawsuits. We're tired of the Inspector General's reports. And we're tired of people not being able to control their spending. Right. No one mentioned this. And it's not, this is still at a time period where there wasn't as much information out there. And so I walk in, and it was really difficult. Starting with the fact that I couldn't get anybody to give me my oath of office. Well, I knew that I had a timeline. They had hired me fairly late in the process, and I had to raise $32 million and get this U.S. pavilion up and functioning for millions of guests to visit it in 6 months. So 6 months, I had to raise the money, get the building built, and get my delegations and staff over there. So I'm going in just hard charging. So, okay, I can't get anybody to do my oath of office. I said, who can give me an oath of office? They go, oh, well, a notary. So I start calling around. Where do you find a notary? It's hard to find a notary. Turns out Kinko's has notaries. So I called Kinko's. I go, do you have a notary? They said, yes. I said, will that notary be there tomorrow morning? Yes. I'm like, okay. So I drive over to McLean, Virginia, and I walk into the Kinko's and I asked the woman, I said, could you give me an oath of office? And she said, what is this for? And so I go, well, I'm going to be a U.S. ambassador. She goes, sure. And she runs back into her office and she's like so excited. And she finds these tiny little American flags and she pulls them out. She puts them on the desk. And at this point, people around the copying machines and, they're doing their FedEx boxes or whatever they're doing. They're like, well, what's going on? She goes, this lady's going to be an ambassador. So the entire place got gathered around me and I stood there. I do so solemnly swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. Yes. And at the end of it, everybody's clapping. And so, yeah, I'm done. It's like nothing's going to stand in my way. So soon thereafter, we do a big event at the State Department. It's me, Colin Powell, Dr. Toyota, who's the honorary chair of the Toyota Corporation, the ambassador from Japan, great pictures, international television. And the next morning I get up and I am driving to the airport. Luckily, my husband was with me because I had signed the bilateral agreement between the United States and Japan. And then I had to go to Tokyo immediately thereafter and sign these other agreements.
Wow.
So literally driving up to Dulles Airport, getting to that place, my husband was going to dump me out. And I get a phone call. Hi, Lisa, this is the lawyer at the State Department. And I said, yes. They go, well, we have a problem. Due to the congressional mandate and what your predecessor did, we haven't figured out a way for anybody to pay for your trip. And I said, oh, you mean that trip that I'm going on to sign the other half of this agreement between the United States of America and a foreign country? They go, yes, that trip.
Oh, my gosh.
So my husband said, you know what, Lisa, we can't embarrass our country. We can't embarrass the president. We'll just pay for it and we'll figure it out. And so I ended up going to Japan and doing this extensive trip both in Tokyo and Nagoya. Nagoya was where Toyota was headquartered, and that's where the fair would be.
Okay.
And paying for it all myself. And so I tell people I ate a lot of $10 tuna fish sandwiches and tea because that's what I could afford. Everybody else is out there dining at these expensive restaurants. And I'd come to the, meeting of all the other countries and they'd be talking about the whiskey they'd had the night before. And I'm like, yes, the tea was very good. And it cost me $3. But I flew back and I had to figure out what to do. And what I did is I do what you do in any business situation. I went back, I audited everything that had happened, not only in the fairs that had preceded me, but going back in the history of the World's Fair. And I used my processes to rank and rate what we were doing. I benchmarked what we were doing. I identified what was the underlying cause as to why every single person who went before me had gone so dramatically over budget and run into legal problems. And then I designed a process that fulfilled the vision, but kept me out of trouble.
Brilliant. Well, that is great. I think we could use a lot more of that kind of rigor in most things that happen in the government and elsewhere.
I agree. Definitely. We need to, if something's not working, the reality is this thing was created in the late 1800s. Why anyone would think that you don't have to change the systems and the processes over 150 years. But we see that in government all the time. We see regulations and laws that are created in the 60s and the 70s, even the 80s, for a period of time when the technology was different than it is today. And so I think it's time for us to apply processes and think if we were designing this stuff today with today's technology, how would we design it?
Oh, Lisa, when are you running for office? That would be so nice to have that rigor brought into the questions on Facebook and on all of the large media, right? I mean, it's a whole different world, and you can't apply processes that did not take that into account. Absolutely.
No, you really can't. And the reality is we know where technology is going. And so many things get wrapped into, political and bipartisan discussions, even discussions since the World's Fair was a multilateral institution. And people think that, that it's based on politics, right? That's why people aren't getting along. And what I have learned, and I've run a lot of bipartisan efforts, is that the reality is 75% of the problem, it's not politics, it's people and process. That's what it is. And if you can help people using data and research and frame the problem in a non-threatening way,
Yes.
it's funny. People will step back and go, oh, yeah, you're right. That has nothing to do with politics. That thing's really screwed up.
Right, right. I mean, story is such a powerful motivator and influencer, and is being used obviously by both sides on either extreme. And it is really refreshing to hear someone say, "Hey, let's, story is important, but let's get out of that and come down to what's actually happening here." But the challenge is, of course, is that logic rarely wins over emotion, right?
Yeah, it really doesn't. And it's something that, you as a former retired military personnel would appreciate, is that I was vice chair of DACWIS, Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services.
Yes.
Came into that role right after Tailhook. In fact, that was what we walked into. And we had half Democrats, half Republicans on the committee, and we had very different opinions about what to do. And I finally asked everybody, I said, can I bring in the Baldrige Award system people to help us come up with a way to manage our conversations between us as committee members advising the secretary and us as civilians talking to the military, that's based on process, and take all the emotion out of it. So we actually did all of our reviews on those issues with a system that the Baldrige Award organizers came up for us to use, and it eliminated so many problems.
Will you speak a little bit to that system? I'm not familiar with it, but it sure sounds like we all should be.
So during the Reagan administration, Malcolm Baldrige was the Secretary of Commerce, and people may remember that he died by, I believe, falling off of his horse. He was a big horse person. And in his honor, and it was as Silicon Valley was really Hewlett Packard, Intel, Motorola, all these companies were coming up, and you had the car companies. The administration set up this award. And what the award did is that it gave recognition to companies that had achieved the best manufacturing models. Okay. And so they looked at everything. They looked at people's business plans, their strategic plans. They looked at their process for manufacturing. They looked at the cost points that were involved. The goal was to move the United States and our manufacturing bodies into being the most effective producers at the lowest. What is the underlying cause of a problem we're trying to solve? And then how do we set up systems to manage conversations and set up new processes in order to avoid that problem in the future? And so we actually brought them in to facilitate all of our meetings. And I ended up visiting 52 military bases around the world, interviewing 1,000 people. And the agreement that I helped achieve with the Baldrige folks and the folks at the Department of Defense is that every person who was doing a focus group would be operating literally off the same sheet of paper. And then we would use the same system for taking all of that data back and incorporating it into what would become our recommendation to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs.
Wow. And why are we not still doing that today?
Every time I'm in a meeting, people are like, oh, there's Lisa again. She's going to start bringing up that we need to use processes. I use facilitators. I have in 3 really, really complex situations that have had to take place between, in this case, civilian and military, also public health and food and beverage manufacturers, where I have brought in process facilitators to use process as a mechanism to get people to, as I say, lay down their weapons, come up with a way to manage the conversation, and then agree on how data, so that people trust the data and they trust the recommendations, because in advance they have agreed to all of the things that would produce that information. And so I do this a lot.
That's fantastic. It really is. I'm so inspired, and I have hope that there's ways to bring people together at the table for some really important conversations. Well, so you work in technology, you work in the State Department to make this World Fair thing happen for the United States and everything that's involved, which is clearly very, very complex. How did you get into this idea? And obviously you've got tools now, but how did you start to work with people on turnarounds? How did that come about? And what led you to that?
Yeah, no, what it was interesting it really started when I left the White House at the end of the Reagan days and moved into Intel Corporation, because I was essentially Craig Barrett's troubleshooter. Craig would become, he was the man who hired me. He would become the chief operating officer, the CEO and chairman of the board of Intel. Okay. And as his troubleshooter, I would go out and figure out why something didn't work. And so, for example, before the days of corporate social responsibility, sure, Craig was one of those leaders on the national front that said, we as technologists need to invest in STEM education. Yeah. And so Craig had me use the processes at Intel to evaluate the best way for Intel to engage in the areas around its manufacturing sites to create a significant change in various systems that would bring a pipeline of individuals with the right technical competency to work at Intel. Okay. And so we actually, again, brought in the facilitators, brought in these process people into setting up public-private partnerships between Intel Corporation, the National Labs in New Mexico, and the Albuquerque Public Schools in Hughes, for example. We set up a huge public-private partnership where we actually built a school on Intel property in Arizona, working with KPMG, the school system in Arizona, and Intel Corporation. And so that's where I learned that if you want to turn something around, sometimes you have to create something new. And my philosophy is you almost have to burn it down to the ground and start over with it. But that's where I got started.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I think of, we typically live in a relatively small community, and there can be, but there always is, right? There's always this pushback of like, well, that's not how things are done. That's not how we do it here. What do you do when you run into that? Because that's very much part of it, isn't it?
It is. I will use shuttle diplomacy until I can talk everybody into it. I give a speech called Making What Matters to You Matter to Others. And my philosophy is that you use research and data and a lot of face time to explain to people what the problem is, using data points that they'll believe as to why something's not working, and then listen to their point of view about their pain points. And what I do is I go to person to person to person or organization or groups of people, and I say, I know you're not happy. Sure. So what is it that's causing you the greatest pain? And I bring into whatever model we create an articulation of, these are the things that you want to see have happen. Here are your pain points. I've done my research. I've listened to you, and I can solve your pain points in these 3 ways. So will you get on the bandwagon? And through that, I have talked a lot of people across many, many different sectors who had a not created here attitude into saying, oh, that makes sense. She came to me, she respected me, she listened to me, and then she incorporated what I said into the solution that she devised.
Yes, that sounds very wise. And I know you've worked in both, well, not both, but in corporate, in government, and in nonprofit, and all that is critical for all of those sectors, isn't it?
It is. It's really critical. People are people. And I wrote an article recently because I do fundamentally believe about this. Everybody goes, oh, this time is different. You know, the reality is we talk about social media. We try about these mega regulatory efforts. We try about trying to introduce control into the conversation. Right. We are the same people we were 1,000 years ago. The communications have changed. The speed of communication has changed. We have improved all of our systems and processes, but fundamentally, we are still the same flawed human beings.
Yes.
And so once you recognize that, then you have to deal with it, because at that point, you have to get to pain points, people's own barriers, their own inhibitions, really understanding what is at the root of why they aren't comfortable. Yes. And you have to acknowledge that. And it doesn't matter if it's the Roman Empire or if it's the United States of America in 2022, we're still the same people.
Yes. I will say that the opportunity to be with our family in places where you walk through Roman ruins and you walk through medieval ruins, and you're like, these stories, They're the same stories, a lot of them, right? I mean, really, all of them are the same stories again and again and again, and it's just us as flawed humanity. Yeah, I love that perspective. That's great.
It is. I went, and I would encourage people to do this because I hadn't done this for a long time. I wrote this article about stopping modern day witch hunts, and it was based on this philosophy that if I went back and I studied the German witch hunts in Germany, and which is where they were burning witches, and it was actually one of the largest areas where this was happening. And what you realized is that for certain people to gain power, there had to be a reckoning, right? They were trying to prove their points. You had this conflict going on between the church and the government. People were trying to prove that they had the right answer. Well, the only way you can prove you're right in some cases is that somebody else has to be wrong. And they can't just be wrong. They have to be really, really, really wrong. And so as the bodies pile up, that's your proof. But we have been doing this for a long time. So I went back also and I just started pulling quotes from Socrates and Aristotle. And they could have been quotes from today. They could have been literally quotes about Facebook and TikTok and Twitter today. And it was almost identical to what people were saying today.
Fascinating. That's so, and it's so interesting too that the Stoic movement has had such a resurgence. I don't buy into it as much as it's getting its credit for, but it's interesting that people are at least going back and saying, hey, this ancient wisdom still applies, right? Ancient wisdom, wherever it is that you find it, both the wisdom and the error are still part of our humanity, our shared humanity. And I love that you're recognizing that as you go into these places where you're looking at turnarounds. That's great. Well, tell us. So, give us an example of one that was particularly naughty. I meant KNOTTY. I suppose I should. Challenging.
Well, I think the most recent one that I did was the turnaround of a medical research foundation. This medical research foundation had merged with a patient advocacy education organization. And as soon as they merged, the net revenue started decreasing rapidly. And they didn't understand why. And so they kept switching up horses to try and solve the problem. And so they had a great deal of churn and the money wasn't coming in. And I was hired to turn around the organization. The reality was the organization had a very large endowment. And I think that if it had not had that endowment that was technically tied to the legal entity, they probably would close the entity down and just start it all over again. But what they had to do is they had to basically burn the organization down and rebuild it. And what I tell people, it's almost as if I went to, let's say, New York City, and there are all these beautiful skyscrapers, and somebody said, okay, see that little garage over there on Fifth Avenue? That's your garage. That's your spot. We need the real estate, but we need a skyscraper, no more garages. And so I was brought in to do a massive restructure. In the first 80 days, we did a 49% restructure, ultimately 83% in the first 18 months. And we actually restructured the entire board. So we blew up the board also with the first few days I was there. First 80 days, 49% of the people were asked to leave. And then we had to begin raising money very, very rapidly. Ultimately, within the 3 years I was there and moved it into 4, we did 83% restructure, raised $100 million.
Wow.
And that was going really well until it was exhausting, but it was going very well until February of 2020, right? So I was coming out of the restructure. The restructure ended at the end of December 2019. The fundraising had kicked off, was going extremely well, and boom, there's COVID. And I was working, I'm very proud. I had the plan. We built a 5-year plan. We built budgets for the 5-year plan. We knew that we wanted a certain amount of money invested in particular types of therapies and prevention in order to accelerate impact on the disease. We were shooting forward. And like the whole world, then we ended up with COVID. Right. And so we had to figure out how to bring all of that piece that had such high momentum to its conclusion based on my contractual arrangements as having agreed to be the CEO. And so balancing that during that time period, I ended up extending my stay for an additional year so we could move through it during COVID. But it taught me a great deal about one thing. we built a very, very strong process. We put together a 5-year plan. We put together the budgets for every single year of those 5 years. We identified jobs 1, 2, and 3. We identified exactly how much it would cost. And so when we hit COVID, we knew what our North Star was. We had no doubt whatsoever. And we also implemented a program of constant ranking and rating. Every quarter, we would rank and rate what we were doing, and we would get rid of things. And people don't do that during a turnaround. I think what happens is that you do it initially, but the reality is a turnaround doesn't really come to its point of being able to be stabilized for at least 3 years. I've done them in high tech. I've done them, in multiple different industries. And there just seems to be this timeline that's related to it. You can get a lot of success, but the reality is you need the process in order for it to ultimately fulfill your objective, to ultimately fulfill the results. And so having done those systems and process checks, having that foundational core in place, we were able to thrive and continue to put out the deliverables despite the fact that a lot of hospitals were, not doing anything besides COVID at that point in time.
Sure. Wow. That's that's a huge undertaking. That's just incredible. Well, so I'm just thinking back of you're in technology, you're in government, you're in the nonprofit sphere, and you are absolutely crushing it. Is there ever a time that you doubted yourself?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked, because I told my daughter about something I'd forgotten.
Yeah.
My daughter has been going through, she took a medical leave of absence, and she had been someone who worked in a classroom as a teacher throughout COVID. And as we know, a lot of people quit during that time, and she worked during that time with kids through the entire time period. She was in Texas, so they kept everything open. But she's on a medical leave, and she was feeling that, my career, I've lost my career place, and you did all these wonderful things and nothing ever went wrong for you. And I said, oh no, I just don't talk about it.
Right.
But you've got to remember, I said, what you don't know, because it doesn't show up on my resume, and it was so many years ago, I actually forget about it, is that I had started in the Reagan administration when I was 19 years old. And that was young, right? I graduated from college early. I went back, finished up school, came back to Washington, was working for a foundation that was integrated with Capitol Hill, left that foundation thinking I was going to a political appointment at the Pentagon. And then there hits the rub. Quit my job. I'm so cocky. I think I'm immediately going into the next job. And that didn't happen. It took 8 months for my security clearance to go through the process. Right. And I was 21 years old, and I had my rent to pay, and I was going to graduate school at night, and I had a lot of expenses. And so here's a kid who was a protege who'd done all these amazing things, who basically hit the wall. And I ended up working on a phone bank for 8 months. And I worked on a phone bank, and I am really nice to people who call my house. It doesn't matter what you call my house. I don't yell at you on the phone. I don't slam the phone down on you, because I've been there, and I learned so much about human behavior from that phone bank. But I worked on a phone bank. And I'll give you another story. As I left Intel Corporation, I was starting my own business. I had done a massive turnaround at Intel that ultimately ended up resulting in the infrastructure that supported the Intel Inside program, the first brand campaign for a high-tech company. Of course. And I, once again, had enough hubris that I thought, well, you know what, if Intel's going through this, every company in Silicon Valley is going to go through it. And so I left my job at Intel, and I had one client in hand, and I had mortgage to pay, because at this point I was in my early 30s. And I went around to company after company after company, and I met with them, and I said, you're going to have this problem. It was a legal problem. I said, you're going to have this legal problem because these things are going to happen to you when you move from business to business to business to consumer marketing. Nobody was listening. And finally, at the age of 29 or 30, I forget when it was, I was out of money again. And so I went to a temp agency and signed up. And so again, think about it. Here's somebody that 19 started with Reagan, White House, Pentagon, working for the CEO of Intel Corporation. Yeah. According to her mother, really screwed it up when you left Intel. And I had to sign up for a temp agency. And luckily for me, all of a sudden, those companies that I talked to while I was living on ramen noodles and peanut butter, it it took for 18 months trying to convince people they should hire me. Ultimately, right after that, I started getting the phone calls and I was able to build my business, which ended up being a couple $1 million a year, employing all women who happened to be at the VP level in Silicon Valley, and the company took off. But I have had those two time periods, and that feeling of sitting there having to do something that you don't feel like you're embarrassed, right? I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed to be in that position because I had apparently just screwed up the greatest trajectory on the face of the earth. Right. And so I think the message that I gave my daughter and the message I give to anybody is we've all been there. We've all been there. People just don't talk about it. It's not like you put it on your resume. Maybe we should, but you don't put it on your resume. But the reality is we've all been there.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And the grit factor came about because of a young leader reaching out and asking if I would mentor her through some of the same process that I had gone through years before. And I thought, gosh, what an amazing opportunity this is. But I just have this one story, and started reaching out to all these incredible leaders. They all happen to be military. They all happen to be women, but they're general officers across the services and combat rescue swimmers and aviators from World War II to the present and more. And, all of them had these times and these places where they felt like it wasn't going to work. In fact, it hadn't worked. In fact, they weren't going to be able to push through, right? We do all have those places. And yet we come out with the grit triad came out of the grit factor, which is this commit, learn, and launch model. This bottom part is owning your own story. And that takes a decision, right? At some point, it takes a decision that you're going to be the one in charge of your narrative. You're going to be the one that owns your story and starts that next company when you can't get the job, or continues working until you have enough to be able to go and interview. Where do you think that came from for you, where you were able to say, I'm going to own my own story, and I feel like I've failed. I feel like things have gone completely awry, but I know I'm going to keep making this work.
I will say I was born, much to my parents' chagrin, with a great deal of self-confidence. And I just fundamentally have always believed that if the thing didn't exist, or if the organization that I joined wasn't doing what I wanted to do, sure, then I would just go do it on my own. Yes. And I think people underestimate the power you have to actually do a lot. When I did the World's Fair, when we had all these things going on with the State Department, remember, I went to Kinko's and did my swearing in. Then the best one is they kept telling me that I couldn't get a formal picture of the President of the United States to put in the entrance. Now, you've all been to post offices. Right. Every post office in America has a picture of the President. Every post office in America, every government building does. For some reason, because of the laws Congress passed, we can't give you a picture. So finally, I called some friends of mine at the White House. I go, are there any extra pictures in the basement? They go, oh, yeah, as a matter of fact, there are. I go, okay, great. My chief of staff took a cab over to the door of the White House and stood there outside the gate while someone handed her the 11x14 picture of the President of the United States. We wrapped it up, we took it on the airplane, and we hung it on the wall. I ran an entire government operation with no help from my government. No help from my government. I just called everybody I knew and I go, these are the functions I need to fulfill. These are the things I need to do. Yes. How do we do it this way? How do we do it that way? And I've been doing it since, I tell people I was part of a group of girls who tried out for the top cheerleading squad when I was in high school and we didn't get it. So we started our own and we ended up winning the national competition.
That is a great story, Lisa. Oh my God.
That's the thing. I just have a stubborn streak. I am bound and determined to work my way out of any single box somebody puts me into.
I love that. And I do feel like there is such pressure to put people into boxes, isn't there? Like expectations that you're just going to fit here, you're going to fit here. And that is a great story. That's a great origin story right there. That cheerleading story. That's fantastic.
It was good.
Yeah, that's great. Well, with all of this experience, and your book is relatively recent, right? You're in the last couple of years, sort of like the Grit Factor, kind of part of that COVID launch, but absolutely critical for everybody today. I actually want to know a lot about this book, but the thing that I feel like we need a turnaround of the system at the moment. And I'd love for Lisa Gable to help us out with this. I mean, I feel like everything that you're hearing from all of the different sides, right? Well, you must be at the office. People aren't going to go to the office. We can't get people to apply. We can't retain people. What is going on, and how do we, I mean, I know this is much too big of a question, but how do we apply process to some of the things that we're facing today?
Well, in my book, what I talk about is a 4-step process. It's not exactly brain surgery, but what I have learned in every single step, in every turnaround that I've been involved with, is you need to visualize the future. And what I say by that is, what is your perfect world scenario? If you can close your eyes and visualize how, if you could wave your magic wand, how that thing would function in the future.
Yes.
5 years from now, 10 years from now. Then what you do is you audit the past. You go and you start looking at not just the near-term situation, but go back to the origins of the organization.
Uh-oh.
Back where it was when I was started. We lost market share to the Japanese back in the 80s. We lost market share to the Chinese today. So in this case, we're not manufacturing on US soil. So go back to audit what you did and audit what's currently in place and figure out and rank and rate what's the most important thing you need to do in order to reach that goal. And make a decision. And I think this is the one mistake people keep making. You can only focus on one thing. You can only focus on one thing. If you want to do the other stuff, or if you know that other stuff has to happen in order for you to be able to accomplish that objective, then partner. And by doing so, you rank and rate what you're doing. You start getting rid of things. You focus on that future, and you build the path from where you are today to where that future is going to be. And that path may have to zig and zag. We've had so many things happen. We've had COVID. We have war. We have geopolitical unrest going on right now. We have supply chain problems. So the path's not going to be linear. It's not going to be a straight path, but you never veer off of it because you've got crystal in your mind. This is in Intel's case, number one in chip manufacturing, right? That's the perfect world scenario. What is your scenario? For Ronald Reagan, it was the end of the Cold War, and everything we did at the Pentagon was focused on ending the Cold War. So you get to that perfect world scenario and you build your path and you've done all your homework. So you can execute with speed, confidence, agility, and heart. Stop double checking yourself. Stop going, well, but what about this? You've done all the processes. So just get going. And we don't. We get stuck in just twirling and swirling and analyzing and staring at our navels and whatever term you want to use.
Yes.
Just run as fast as you can. And maybe because of a variety of things in my life, what I've recognized is when the door's open, it's only open for a short period. Run as fast as you can, get as far as you can on that highway. And then when the door shuts, you wait for it to open again. And it's not going to stay open the entire time, but you're going to get there.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Well, I mean, I feel like what you're describing, and it clearly works for people in the government sector or organizations that are corporate or nonprofit, but also, I mean, it would work for individuals, wouldn't it? Like you're visualizing your future, you're looking at the past, you're finding that path and you're focusing on one thing. I mean, that is just excellent advice from somebody who has done this over and over again.
It's hard to do. Yesterday I had the honor of speaking to 100 women that were part of a business fellowship in Ukraine. And that really puts a reality check on everything that you say, right? Because I had to think about, how do I take my process and help these women use it in order for them to retain focus on the things that are most important to them when they literally have missiles coming down on them, when they literally are losing their homes, when they have these things happening where they have such incredible ambiguity. And what we talked about is the timeline may get elongated. But if you know that something needs to happen in order for you to be able to move forward to the future state that you want to be in, keep your eye on it, but also be willing to give yourself a little grace. When you said, how does apply? I do talk a lot about that in the book. Give yourself some grace. Celebrate what you can celebrate. don't make it so unattainable that it has to be so big before we celebrate it. So
Right.
take small steps and celebrate the small steps.
Yes, yes, that is very sage advice. And that is an incredible honor. I can't even imagine how they're working through that right now. That's just it's almost impossible. Wow. So where are you seeing people when they bring you in? Where do people still get hung up? What are the sticking points that are the hardest to move through?
They start the process with assumptions. And the number one thing that I tell people is start your process with no assumptions. No assumptions.
Right.
You can't have any. You think that this person is going to react this way. You think that they did react that way based on a reason that you've devised as the reason they acted that way. It's like children, right? I always tell children, I'm not sure that's what they meant. You come in with an assumption of what your limitations are. Come in with no assumptions, zero assumptions.
Right.
You are starting from scratch. In your mind's eye, you may not literally be burning the institution down to the ground, but you have to get your you have to get your brain to the place where it's flatland.
Right.
And then you're determining how you're going to build from there based on where you want to go.
How do you get to that place of no assumptions? I mean, we all have them, right? We all come with all of this baggage in a sense, whether it's baggage that's good or baggage that's bad. It certainly exists.
You do it through two ways. I mean, one is you just keep reminding people, nope, wave your magic wand. Nope, don't, you can't, you just stop them, right? You stop them in the conversation. No, not going to talk about that because we're going to wave our magic wand. What do you want it to look like? What do you want it to look like? Where do you think it's going to be the most functional? Yeah. And the other is you do have to facilitate conversation. I do spend a great deal of initial upfront investment with personnel on executive coaching. Bringing people into facilitated sessions. You heard that I brought in facilitators to the Pentagon.
Yes.
And you have to have facilitated discussion to get people to stop fighting is one of the most critical elements. People do fight. They just do. You have passive aggressive people. You've got the strong-willed people, and the people who don't show up. You got the quiet people who actually do know the answers.
Yes.
You need a way of getting all of that information out in a manner that is non-threatening to everybody.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's so important. I mean, that just is, that should be the ground rules, and it's very hard to get there. But I like your idea of using a facilitator. Backing up a little bit, actually backing up a lot to working on the Dakowitz committee, to coming in as Tailhook is happening. Yeah. And we'll certainly add in a little bit to this episode on what that meant. I was just graduating college then, by the way, and taking my commission in the Army as Tailhook happened. How did that process end up working for that committee? And did that bring it further forward in a meaningful way, do you think?
It did. What happened is I was what's called a midnight appointment of George H.W. Bush. So what happens is President of the United States can sign off on some commissions and boards and appointments that have to be sworn in under the next president. So I was sworn in by Les Aspin, who was Secretary of Defense, to Bill Clinton. As a result of that, when I began on the commission, right after Bill Clinton's inauguration, 50% of the commission members were Republicans and 50% were Democrats. And that with very, very different belief systems about the U.S. military, about how the military should operate, about the independence of the military's judicial system, which adds, as you know, a bit of complication to the entire thing. And so we had people that were polarized on their opinions. And whether it was EEO attorneys, of whom we had a lot on the committee, versus individuals who may have served or had military members who had served, who had worked in a civilian capacity with the military. And so fundamentally different points of view. And therefore, what did we all start with? Our assumptions. We all started with our assumptions. And what did we fight about for the first year? We all fought about our assumptions. And we brought it into, as part of Dakowitz, you have to commit to at least going to a certain number of U.S. military bases on your own dime during your initial time period. Okay. And because they want you to actually talk to the people who are going to have to do the thing you're talking to them about.
Sure.
We'd all been out there talking, but we brought our assumptions into each conversation. You start asking a question in a way that's going to validate your assumption. And so by bringing in the Baldrige people with a neutral discussion format in which people were not allowed to have their personal opinion at all reflected in the question, and they were also told that they had to have somebody taking down the answers verbatim. So it was off the record, but non-disclosed who it was. And so when the reports got put forward, the reports were based on information that was what someone said, not an interpretation of what that person said. And then we did the process of everybody coming back from those military bases all over the world. And we went into those rooms and we did the big white papers. And so we put those big white papers on the board, and they had done what they do, which is they said, okay, we had, like 1,000 people said this and 1,000 people said that. So some people said it was back-to-back deployments that were causing the problem. Some said we didn't have enough equipment, housing situations. There were a lot of issues that the military personnel were unhappy with. It was during Kosovo. And so we had that information up there on these sheets, and we had generals, admirals, and civilians who were given their stickies. And everybody got 5 stickies. And what you had to do is vote on what you thought you heard were the most important issues during all of your focus groups. And you could put all 5 stickies on one thing, or you could put 1 sticky on each thing. Ultimately, what happened is that sexual harassment was at the bottom of the list. Because they were in the middle of Kosovo, the back-to-back deployments were the number one issue, and the issues around maintaining military aircraft and a lot of other things, just hardship in day-to-day work and being able to fulfill the mission. And that was putting a great deal of stress on military families also, because people weren't seeing their loved ones. And housing was a big issue.
Right.
And there were other issues that came to the top. And so our assumptions were on all of us, our assumptions were 100% wrong when you went back and compared what we heard and documented based on what we thought when we walked in.
That's fascinating. Wow. What an incredible process, and what a valuable process.
It was really, I can't believe how many years it's been. It's been 6 years. I have a picture I show of that time period of what I looked like, and I'm really tiny, and I didn't grow, and I looked really, really young. So I look at those pictures, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe anybody listened to me, but we don't.
Well, I'm glad they did. That's excellent. One of the things we talk a lot about at the Grit Institute is purpose. And one of the things that a lot of the studies that are coming out around the Great Resignation and around the challenges that have surfaced, and I wouldn't say have gone away at all, but have surfaced after COVID, is a lack of purpose. What gives you purpose?
Knowing what my top goals are. Even in my own life, I set up jobs 1, 2, and 3. I really do. It's the only way I can function. Yeah. And I constantly ranking and rating what I'm doing with my time and getting rid of stuff that doesn't fulfill what I want to see have happen. And obviously the needs of my family are part of that. But I become very focused on whatever the goal. And I think of my life in phases. I tell everyone I'm in the 3rd phase of my career right now. And so that phase is different than phase 2 and phase 1. And therefore it has different assumptions as to what I'm going to do as making decisions. And so right now, what I'm focused on is I want to take all the experience that I've had, of which you've said it's highly unusual. I've met with people from all over the world in all categories at all levels, and help leverage that through giving the next generation of leaders the tools they need and the inputs they need to solve the big problems. And I'm no longer leading the charge. What I'm trying to do is empower those who have to lead the charge next, and taking everything that I've gone through and trying to put it into a framework where other people can utilize it, so they don't have to go slide down to the bottom of the barrel like I've had to on a couple of occasions. They don't have to be living off that migraine medicine because I've already gone through it. So how can I help them be successful?
That's amazing. And you've written the book for people to follow that blueprint. And I'm so excited for all listeners to pick it up and frankly, bring into their organizations and bring into their community groups. And it's one that I wish, honestly, that I'd had access to before several different projects I can think of in the not so distant past. So thank you, Lisa. Just incredible experience, incredible stories, and true wisdom that I really do hope finds its way as far and wide as possible. And this world certainly needs you right now.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I would just encourage people to, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Instagram and Facebook. But I do answer questions when people send me questions. And, I've been able to provide people with some answers, give them some pointers, and I look forward to hearing from you.
That's Facing the Wind, Season 2 of The Grit Factor. Thank you for being here. As always, it's great to have you listening in. And if you enjoyed this episode, would you subscribe, leave us a review, and share with a friend? And make sure to pick up your own copy of The Grit Factor for candid stories and lessons from leaders in the vanguards of their fields. If you have a question you'd like to ask, send me a voicemail through the link at my website at thegritinstitute.com/podcast. See you next week.